Keith Muir, Professor Glover, Fran, and other members of the Colley family, ladies and gentlemen. The historic New South Wales Wilderness Act had its origins on the banks of the Carr River. I'd been invited there shortly after being appointed Minister for Planning and Environment in the Rand government. And Milo Dunphy organised with a party of bushwalkers on this exploration part of the Inaugural National Park. Milo took me deep into the wilderness through the Bulga-Dennis Canyon, and I was to revisit the Cowmung on many occasions, very often with Milo. But striding along the river on that occasion with Pat Thompson, the Colley Foundation, I faced this suggestion coming from Pat. What we need, Minister, is a New South Wales Wilderness Act. I knew about the historic resonance here, namely that America had a Wilderness Act from 1964. And I was very interested in the concept of whether legislation in Australia could achieve similar outcomes. On introducing the Act in 1987, I said to the New South Wales Parliament, and I quote, "Australian history is a story of the interaction between migrant peoples and a continent with unique landscapes, plants and animals. If we lose our feel for the grand old continent and its natural condition, then we lose something of our character as a people. The case for conservation is founded therefore on patriotism. Our commitment to protecting our wilderness is a measure of our maturity as a nation and a measure of pride, our pride in our identity. Saving these, that's the end of the quote, saving these vast wild places preserves our rich indigenous cultural heritage. They are reservoirs of scientific and cultural treasures, like the hundreds of drawings discovered at Eagles Reach in the Wallamite Wilderness. The case was very strong. I was honoured to present it to the Parliament with keen voluntary conservationists in the gallery, taking an interest in every stage of the debate. It passed the Parliament on November the 24th. There is a law to protect wild Australia, in New South Wales at least, to protect it from exploitation by graziers, miners, loggers and high-impact recreation. Alex has written that wilderness comprises the last substantial remnants of the ecologically complete environment that once covered the earth. None of these areas, he argues, remain unaffected by some form of development, but they're the best we've left and often the last refuge of many endangered species. Their protection is of enormous significance in this arid continent. Australia's future relies on healthy soil, air and water systems. Wilderness provides their best protection. Ancient forests that purify our air, pristine catchments that yield water that doesn't require expensive treatment. Wilderness is where you find peace, solitude and the opportunity for reflection away from the pressures of modern living. Our Wilderness Act offers hope that wild places will remain unspoilt like this. In wilderness, we can be a step closer to nature. We can grasp that we are indeed part of a web of life. But the question that we face is, can the Wilderness Act protect native wildlife from all external influences, from population growth, pest species, climate change, and other all-pervasive influences? Can wilderness exist in the 21st century, or is it rapidly fading? Well, the good news is that the New South Wales Act anticipated some of the pressures we now face. Perhaps it reflects some of the original forms of land management. Perhaps it's a subconscious response to our wild continent and its vast outback. It's different from the American Wilderness Act in that it allows areas to be managed and restored to a state of substantially modified by humans. And this provision might well ensure that our wilderness areas become even more precious. Without provision to restore wilderness, few wilderness areas would ever have been protected and management of these few would not be effective. The Americans have been grappling with wilderness management since 1964, and their act requires wilderness to remain untrammelled by man. Few areas are untrammelled, and climate change is rapidly reducing that number. Southwest America has seen more than 60 mega fires in the last 10 years. These fires are destroying wilderness forests that now have no resilience to wildfire because they've been subjected to decades of fire suppression. Exclusion of fire from these fire-prone forests has proven fatal. In New South Wales, wilderness is not managed as a landscape of static ecosystems, although much of it contains old-growth forests with various fire histories that go back millennia. Well, what are the options for management? Rangers have lived with this question since the world's first national park was established on the southern edge of Sydney in 1879. Their response boils down to three choices. One, management can drive ecosystems away from a pristine or otherwise historic condition through transformation. And this was exactly what the earlier acclimatation and zoological societies did with the Royal by introducing deer and creating a freshwater pond on Kangaroo Creek for English perch and trout. There are lots of other examples you're all familiar with in Australia's history. Two, conservation effort more usually seeks the process of restoration to increase the historical faithfulness of an area by mitigating environmental impacts. And three, natural environments are purposely or not left free of active management to either recover to an historic condition or drift towards a novel, more modified condition. Slowly, the American ideal of wilderness management, the perpetuation of whole historical ecosystems through passive untrammelling, is seen as no longer tenable in the long run. The natural environment is dynamic, and the IUCN now defines wilderness areas that are protected and managed so as to preserve their natural condition. Protected and managed to preserve their natural condition. And according to the IUCN, the primary objective of this management is to protect the long-term ecological integrity of natural areas that are undisturbed by significant human activity, so that current and future generations have the opportunity to experience such areas. Wilderness management, at least in New South Wales, has evolved to embrace conditions of passive recovery and active restoration. After a severe wildfire, for example, wilderness areas are closed to public visitation to allow for seedling germination and let dangerous burnt-out trees fall. During closure, emergency containment lines bulldozed into wilderness are rehabilitated, and then after about 3 months, left to their own devices. Sometimes active pest management strategies are applied to aid wildlife recovery through the suppression of foxes and cats. And at this time, small marsupials are more prone to predation. These procedures are standard practice for wilderness areas in this state. Even the Carr, part of one of the most pristine wildernesses near Sydney, is managed to maintain its old-growth forest and high levels of plant diversity. Volunteers have removed willows from its banks, and rangers have shot out the famous feral cattle. Removal of these ecosystem change agents meant that the Cowmung's iconic grassy river banks began to disappear, but nobody anticipated the devastation that would accompany the influx of feral pigs in the early 1990s. Rangers had assumed the area was unsuitable for feral pigs until a large population became established. In one season, the Inaugural wilderness was changed forever. Every single grassy bank on the Cowmung was overturned, and it took a decade of determined effort to bring these pests under control. The arrival of hundreds of feral goats in the area has presented similar challenges requiring constant professional management and significant resources. Blue gum forest is another example. Blue gum has been closed to camping for several decades, and over that time it's been restored to what it once was, a wet sclerophyll forest with a rich understory full of lawyer vine. Bush regenerators have worked tirelessly to exclude invasive weeds washed down from urban areas upstream, and the forest would not exist at all if it were not for active fire management. A truly heroic backburn stopped the 2013 wildfire from reaching the forest, but the Rangers' efforts hardly raised a mention in the media as the tragic events of the related fire unfolded at Springwood. Not all wilderness management in New South Wales is appropriate. Current experiments with horse riding risk transforming wilderness environments. Australia's flora evolved in the absence of hard-hoofed grazing animals and is less resistant to trampling damage from horses. Our fragile soils are often very low in nutrients, so that horse manure, weeds and introduced pathogens from horses are major threats. These factors, combined with grazing, can bring about significant changes to the natural environment. The majority of Australian park managers, almost unconsciously, did not accept passive management of wilderness. Any ecosystem drift to altered states is usually the result of a lack of park resources, not deliberate intent. Bell mine and dieback and lantana infestation, which occur in certain hardwood forests, such as Richmond Range near Casino. The influx of the cane toad to the north coast are the saddest examples. These change agents are beyond the capacity of managers to tackle until new pest control methods can be developed. So does wilderness matter? Wilderness has been labelled a state of mind in our high-tech world, where it is under ever-increasing threat. Wild plants, animal communities and wilderness landscapes are, however, a scientific reality. They did not arise by farming, by adaptive management or conservation offsets, but through millions of years of natural selection and evolution in a landscape in which modern man was absent. Humanity is only a recent consideration in the evolutionary scheme of things. Dr. Hayden Washington explains, quote, "One can argue about the definition and boundaries, but large natural areas do exist. They are real places with real problems that need real protection," unquote. Most attacks on wilderness are by those who either wish to exploit it or feel threatened by it. Such attacks can only increase with population growth and will put the very idea of national parks at risk. Our national parks are the cornerstone of conservation in this state. They are vital biological islands in a sea of developed land. The richness of plants and animal diversity that can survive in our parks will continue to shrink unless they are kept intact and linked by conservation efforts across the entire landscape. Efforts for connectivity must push back against the extraction of natural resources, which usually causes ongoing ecological fragmentation, degrades or destroys native vegetation and elevates extinction risk. Wilderness maintains ecological integrity and is the best way to protect native flora and fauna over the long run. A review of conservation theory suggests the following. 1. Large reserves are usually better than small reserves. 2. Large populations or connected populations are better than small. 3. Human actions elevate species extinction risks. 5. Fragmentation reduces the amount of habitat, increases edge effects, and subdivides and isolates populations. And finally, resilience requires maintenance of the evolved primary productivity in landscapes, which is defined by the dominant plants, decomposers and other wildlife that maintains a landscape's infrastructure. These principles define wilderness and wilderness management. A wilderness can survive decades of neglect because of its natural resilience and be subjected to a tyranny of small decisions. But it does not survive forever, and for many areas, time's running out. We live as a species as if creation belongs to us, not we to creation. We forget that we live on an insignificant minor planet where we've modified most of the biosphere to our own needs. A continued denial of our ongoing planetary modification will possibly result in our extinction. Our grandchildren will manage this finite future world with a very different outlook from us. It will be a globe with an altered climate, compromised ecosystems, diminished biodiversity, and over 8 billion people by 2030. There will be winners and many more losers, but soon we must emerge a new paradigm where the natural environment is not external to human activity, but seen as central to decision making, not at odds with our economic prosperity, but seen as essential to it. The greatest single benefit of retaining large intact natural areas is not the immediate values placed in these areas by contemporary society, but the options they give future generations, their worth to nature itself. The retention of wilderness, where nature has a right to exist, is essential for our survival. It allows us to have a perspective other than the human species. Wilderness, not unsurprisingly, can deliver nature conservation outcomes more cost efficiently than smaller or more compromised protected areas. The smaller perimeter to area ratios and more intact biological communities in wilderness should enable better long-term conservation outcomes. It's better and cheaper to keep a number of wilderness areas in good condition than to rehabilitate a large number of fragmented landscapes with a lower total area. With regard to accelerated climate change, large intact natural areas should be managed to ensure ecological integrity, not to maximise tourism opportunities through development of roads and wilderness lodges in core areas. Conservation planners must consider climate change scenarios in developing areas for the persistence of biodiversity. Major climatically driven changes cannot be accommodated by small, isolated, protected areas. Although there are exceptions, such as our alpine ash forests, Australia's wilderness areas have a significant ability to bounce back from the impacts associated with accelerated climate change, such as wildfire. Interconnected habitats within wilderness are less likely to be subject to complete loss of one or several plant or animal species from more frequent wildfire or severe storms. Well, let's look at what has been achieved. In 1986, the Wilderness Working Group that I established reported that about 4.4% of New South Wales remained in wilderness condition, although Western New South Wales was not considered. The Labor Party lost office before it was able to implement its recommendations, but in March 1995, when I led Labor back to government, we did so with a policy of 16 wilderness areas for reservation, embracing the core old-growth forests of eastern New South Wales, and of these, 14 were declared. In 1999, we made a further commitment to significantly expand wilderness protection, and this led to 270,000 hectares being protected in 2002, and an additional 70,000 hectares of private land acquired using the Dunphy Wilderness Fund. In total, New South Wales Labor has added over 1.3 million hectares to the wilderness estate since 1995, and from 1995 to 2011, over 2 million hectares have been protected under the Wilderness Act 1987. Vast wilderness areas may exist in the Western Division, but these have not been formally examined, and only the Mugwinji wilderness has been protected in this region, which comprises 2/3 of the state. The Wilderness Act also places an obligation on the Director of National Parks to provide for scientific research and education with regard to wilderness. The duty is being tentatively neglected, which feeds back to the general perception of wilderness in the community. There's a lot at risk, but there are things that can be done. Tasmania's largest unprotected wilderness, the Tarkine, which contains Australia's largest tract of rainforest wilderness, was saved from logging but is threatened by mining. This encompasses the Norfolk Range, Mount Bertha, the Savage River System, and the Meredith Range. But despite a 2010 Australian Heritage Commission recommendation for national heritage listing of 433,000 hectares of the Tarkine, the former government only recognised a very limited coastal strip for its Aboriginal heritage. The Tarkine wilderness was not adequately protected and risks being degraded because of its extensive mineral potential. 10 new mines are proposed over the next 5 years, and 9 of these will be large open cut mines. The chair of the Australian Heritage Council, Professor Carr Lawrence, said the Tarkine is of international significance. To damage it would be a global tragedy. To quote him, it has unique biodiversity and a history that is global in its import. That's why people have suggested that it should be World Heritage listed. The Kimberley has similar character, unquote. It's one thing to decide not to list a heritage property, quite another to destroy one already listed. In March this year, that was what our Prime Minister sought. We told the timber industry dinner in Canberra that too many of Australia's forests were, quote, locked up, unquote. Mr Abbott said, quote, we have quite enough national parks. We have quite enough locked up forests already. In fact, in an important respect, we have too much locked up forest, unquote. His government asked UNESCO to remove 74,000 hectares of Tasmanian forest from the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, an area that includes some of the country's oldest trees and important Aboriginal sites. No Australian government has ever before proposed doing this, that is, delisting World Heritage on this magnitude. In fact, no first world democracy has made such a drastic delisting proposal. To give you an understanding of the scale here, the area proposed for delisting is twice the combined size of Royal and Ku-ring-gai national parks. The federal government claims the area proposed for removal contains 117 patches of disturbed forest. Peter Hitchcock, consultant to advise on last year's World Heritage Extension, said this forest disturbance claim seriously misrepresents the proposed delistings because these elements are only a minor part of the lands proposed to be delisted. This claim, described as a minor boundary variation by Environment Minister Greg Hunt, is an example of the purity argument, where wilderness is presented as pristine and any disturbance makes the area unsuitable for reservation. This ignores the fact that reserve management can restore such wilderness areas. Last week I celebrated, as I'm sure you did, at the news that the committee had almost scornfully rejected the Australian proposal. So congratulations to everyone who made representations. I'd sent an email to the office of the Foreign Minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, and I was assured that it had been passed on to the German representative of the committee. I think it was effective lobbying, and it was effective lobbying in a very just cause. At the same time, the Abbott government has sanctioned the destruction of 16,000 acres of the magnificent Bimblebox Nature Refuge on private land in the Galilee Basin for a coal mine, and they've approved the dumping of 3 million tonnes of dredge spoil from Abbott Point on the Great Barrier Reef. Less damaging options exist, such as diverting open-cut mining around the Bimblebox Reserve, and in the case of Abbott Point, onshore spoil disposal. There's been a growing global response to this threat to the reef. In a move to support the World Heritage Committee, Deutsche Bank will no longer finance the port expansion unless it can be assured the reef won't be harmed. On May 23rd, The Guardian reported that the bank had bowed to public pressure after 180,000 Germans had signed a petition urging them not to fund this expansion. Such action clearly indicates the current government's eroding Australia's standing as a leader on environmental policy. Given the pressures that natural areas are subject to, it's appropriate that wilderness becomes a criterion for inscription on the World Heritage List of properties. Areas like the Tarkine and the Kimberley would benefit from World Heritage recognition. Such listings will give these wilderness areas the recognition and the protection they deserve through the bilateral federal-state government processes that regulate the nomination and management of World Heritage areas in Australia. Australia, through the World Heritage Committee, should start the process for UNESCO to advance wilderness as one of the criteria in its World Heritage operational guidelines for the assessment of nominated natural properties. Such a criterion would reflect the true value and the role of wilderness in this increasingly crowded world. The wilderness listing criteria would also assist the protection of extensive wilderness in Queensland, Western Australia and the Northern Territory, as well as Tasmania. In 1988, David Suzuki estimated that wilderness would no longer exist outside reserves within 30 years. It's imperative that we protect as much of Australia's wilderness and biodiversity as possible, including areas already in national parks. Wilderness protection within national parks should be something that all political parties are willing to advance. It should be a patriotic duty. Every state and territory, except for Tasmania, has wilderness legislation, but only the mainland states, Victoria, South Australia and New South Wales, as well as the ACT, have protected wilderness areas under their respective statutes. Protected wilderness should be permanent, yet in the current political climate, those who seek to ride, develop and log in wilderness within national parks need to be stopped again. Even in New South Wales, there are those afoot to log and graze our parks. It's happening on a trial basis in the River Red Gum parks and is mooted for the pillar. The International Convention on Biological Diversity requires the federal government to protect wilderness. The Convention's definition of ecosystem and habitats includes wilderness for the purposes of identification and monitoring. This should be stretched to include development control. It's time that all national parks and the wilderness areas within them be permanently secured under federal environmental law. A National Wilderness Act should be supported by all political parties and enable 1. Federal government review of its national wilderness inventory, 2. Protection of all wilderness within national parks under federal environmental law, 3. Allowing the federal government to enter into an agreement with the states and territories to manage lands identified in existing reserves, negotiate for inclusion in national parks, public lands in wilderness condition, and enable negotiations for the purchase, lease or management of private lands identified as being suitable for inclusion in a national system of wilderness reserves. National wilderness legislation should also recognise the rights of the respective state or territory to nominate the authority responsible for management. Citizens, community groups and the federal government should also have the right to prosecute the appointed authority in a federal court for failure to comply with the provision of the National Wilderness Act. Well, let me say in conclusion that Australia is one of the few countries still lucky enough to have undeveloped land. We accept wilderness as an everyday and integral part of the landscape, while people from crowded countries are spellbound by it. Short-term economic thinking has returned to the political landscape. We need to rethink decision-making that has little or no regard for our common future and treat these precious places very carefully. Who can deny the impact wilderness has had on political history? Wilderness has enriched many of our lives, whether it's the impact of the Peter Dombrowski's image of Rock Island Bend that marked the turning point in the Franklin Dam campaign, or when we enjoyed the spellbinding views from Blue Mountains lookouts. All these places exist through the effort of visionary conservationists like Miles and Milo Dunphy, behind the scenes stalwarts like Alex Colley. We're so lucky to have such precious wilderness, but it can vanish in a moment. We must go to these areas passionately, veto the harmful projects that threaten them, restore them to an unmodified state, pushing back as best we can against changes that this century will bring to the Australian bush. The population has grown. There's that staggering confirmation that since 2008 we've had 2 million added to the Australian population. We've got the highest rate of population growth in the developed world in Australia. The population growing, and as it does, pressure to exploit natural resources intensifies. Our wilderness areas are coming under increasing threat. Right now, the Baird government is considering proposals to turn the Nepean floodplain into real estate, renewing plans to raise the Warragamba Dam wall that would in turn inundate wilderness and smother it with sediment. A second Sydney airport at Badgerys Creek has been announced and will be less than 5 kilometres from the boundary of the Blue Mountains National Park. If this new airport is built, flight paths must not be diverted over wilderness, generating unacceptable noise pollution. Sydney should be renowned worldwide as a large city surrounded by a belt of wilderness quality national parks and reserves. These national parks, however, will remain at risk from the tyrannies of self-interest, short-sightedness and the damaging effects of population pressure, such as increased urban runoff. There is hope in the Blue Mountains and elsewhere in New South Wales that a new generation has developed a more caring relationship between the community and the natural world. The Blue Mountains towns now see themselves as a city within a World Heritage National Park. its council is prepared to fight to recent 11,000 hectare addition made by the Baird government to Natai Wilderness further enhances protection of Sydney's drinking water catchment and demonstrates welcomed bipartisan support for the goal of wilderness. If wilderness is to survive into the 21st century, it needs to regain status in conservation management. Wildlife corridors cannot be effective without wilderness conservation and the core ecological integrity that wilderness provides. Our survival, the survival of all life, is wrapped up in how we respond to this challenge. The words of Henry Thoreau are as true today as when they were first read in 1851. In wilderness is the preservation of the world, and wilderness is the preservation of the world. Whether we see wilderness conservation as pragmatic resource management, whether we treat wilderness as a scientific storehouse of biodiversity or as an object of beauty, and therefore a source of human creativity and spiritual peace, the future of Australian wilderness is inextricably bound up with the future of all life on this planet. Thank you.